Welcome to a brief tutorial on attack trees. The basic idea with an attack tree is to structure the process of identifying threats in relation to a particular system or mechanism or set of security policies. In this particular case, I'm going to look at a very simple example for trying to learn a user's Unix password. And the purpose of this particular example is really just to illustrate the basic processes and identify the actual symbols and their use in the attack tree. An attack tree always begins with a top-level goal, which in this case is stated as learn user's Unix password. Now, this goal is not going to be something that can be instantly, immediately solved in one stroke. So this goal is something that in turn needs to be broken down into its parts. Now, if you look at the symbol that's been used for this root node, as it's called in the tree, it has these two little pointy corners at the bottom, and this is a symbol that's used in the software that was actually used to create this particular sort of tree. It indicates what's known as an OR node. There are basically three types of nodes, as you may have noticed in the diagram in an attack tree. We have AND nodes, OR nodes, and what are known as leaf nodes, which essentially terminate the tree. So the ones with the pointy corners are our OR nodes. The ones with the flat bottom but the rounded top are AND nodes, and the simple square ones with no rounded parts are the leaf nodes that terminate a particular scenario for a set of attacks. So this root node, the starting point in the tree, is an OR node. And an OR node is one where we simply, for that particular goal, we are able to essentially break it down and say that there are multiple options for solving that particular attack. So at the root, we have learned the user's Unix password, and the fact that we have an OR node, that means that we have several different options, in this case 4 different options, that allow us to solve that problem or essentially achieve that particular attack goal. With an AND node, as you probably have guessed, an AND node has the property that to meet that particular attack goal, we have to actually sort of accomplish multiple requirements. So with the AND node here, we have in fact 2 different sub-steps of that, both of which need to be able to be achieved in order to meet that high-level goal. A leaf node on an attack tree essentially means that this is an attack that can be completed without needing to meet any other further requirements or to specify more detailed options for achieving that particular goal. So this essentially ends the tree at that point. Every end point in the tree, as you can probably notice in this particular diagram, concludes with a leaf node. One of the issues that you need to deal with in creating an attack tree is to find the right balance between essentially building the tree and going to sometimes extreme lengths in terms of specifying what makes up a particular attack. And I'll come back to this shortly as we look into the example in a bit more detail, because there are in fact numerous different ways that you can take any particular attack that's presented to you and expand on this to the nth degree. So there needs to be a point at which you say that is a atomic attack, in a sense. It's not something that can be broken down into subparts. That is actually the end of the process for that particular attack scenario. The point at which you do this is something that you more or less need to decide yourself. My suggestion with this is you think very carefully about the assumptions that are relevant in your particular for your particular scenario, and identify at what point you want to stop trying to break things down into more detail and actually find the concluding attack for that scenario. As you lay down the groundwork in terms of these assumptions, then it becomes easier to identify whether you need to keep extrapolating further or whether you can sort of simply conclude the attack scenario at that point. This particular attack tree is very, very small for obvious reasons, and therefore, as we'll see, it's very, very easy for any of these leaf nodes really to be expanded into more detail. And if this were a real exercise, a real attack tree that you're creating to genuinely find out information about this attack scenario, then you would do that process. You would expand it out to significantly more detail. Okay, so if we start now with our root node, which is our high-level goal. It's the overall goal. Obviously, this needs to be clear to you before you can start the process. We then look at the list of high-level, top-level attacks. So this is the basic set of ways that you can achieve this. So to learn a user's Unix password, I have here 4 different general scenarios for this. An online guessing attack is very simply the attacker tries to log into the system repeatedly, trying different username and password combinations, or trying a fixed username and variable password combinations. Convince the user to reveal is the next sort of attack. So you can learn a user's password from the user directly, and so that is obviously one particular technique that could be used. Obtain the password from the password file is another option, and obtain the password as it's entered. So that's a particular sort of example there. Now, if we look at our online guessing attack, essentially for the level of detail that's been assumed to be necessary in this particular sort of scenario here, we are assuming that an online guessing attack, the way of doing that and any requirements there are essentially self-evident. You could expand this out though. You could indicate the requirement that an attacker knows the username. Otherwise, it's not possible really to have any chance of guessing a particular user's password if you don't know their username. This means another requirement here is that the attacker is able to actually log into the system. That is, they can connect over a network, or they can sit in front of the computer and mount this online attack in terms of interactively logging in or attempting to log into the system. So this node here could easily be expanded. Convincing the user to reveal the password. Here I've given 2 options. Remember, this is an OR node, so it expresses options for achieving that. First option, you can threaten them. Second option, you can socially engineer. Now, again, we can expand threaten user if we wanted to identify the many and varied ways that we might threaten the user. We could threaten them directly. We could threaten them with physical harm. We could blackmail them. We could threaten their family. There's a whole load of options there. I don't think those options are of particular interest from an IT security professional's point of view, so I think it's very sufficient to simply terminate that sort of branch of the tree at that point. Social engineering, you could definitely expand on this as well. You could say social engineering options, well, you have maybe making a phone call, and in some scenarios that might be a very effective way. You could social engineer using various email, phishing / spear phishing kind of attacks. Again, this is something you could expand if it were relevant to what you're actually trying to achieve or learn from the creation of the attack tree. Obtaining the user's password from the password file. This here is an AND node because it says in order to obtain the user's password from the password file, because we are going to assume that the password file contains sort of cryptographic hashes of the password rather than the plaintext password, then we are going to need to both obtain the hash and then successfully mount a dictionary attack on that hash. So these 2 requirements here are both necessary to be achieved in order to obtain the password file. So while the OR node indicates options for an attack, an AND node essentially indicates constraints, requirements that would need to be met by the attacker for the attack to be successful. Obtaining the password hash is then one of these requirements that needs to be met, and that could be obtained, the actual process for obtaining this will be different whether the password is in a shadowed password file or whether the password file itself is world readable. Now again here very clearly this could be certainly expanded in terms of if the password file is shadowed, it may be very difficult for the attacker to easily obtain this. So you could expand that by looking at some possible attacks for achieving that. For example, stealing the hard drive or stealing the computer itself physically, or alternatively compromising the system using some kind of malware that's able to achieve root access. Again, that's an attack that you might very well exclude because at that point, of course, there's no point in really learning the user's password. Another option might be some kind of a sort of redirection attack, temporary file race condition attack, possibly there. World readable password file, obviously that's a lot easier, but there are still constraints there that this attack tree doesn't expand on, doesn't express. So, for example, the world readable password file is of no use to the attacker if the attacker themselves don't have access to the system. So that's something that would need to be, you would need to expand on that as a requirement. And of course, if it's a requirement, then this would become a new subtree involving an AND node to express those requirements. A dictionary attack there, again, we've kind of concluded the attack. We could expand on this. If you've attained the password hash, the second requirement to meet is the dictionary attack. This dictionary attack, to be successful, depends upon how much computational power you've got, the effectiveness of your sort of attack methodology and mechanics, using a optimized sort of hashing algorithm, and various sort of properties associated with that sort of thing. And of course, it depends very much on the actual entropy in the user's password. How long/complex is the user's password? So that's another issue that you again could expand on to learn more about this particular attack. Obtain the user's password when entered. So there's a couple of different options here that have been expressed. There's visual observation. So you happen to observe the user typing in the password, or you happen to be sort of shoulder surfing, as it's called, and able to see the password as it's entered. A keylogger is perhaps a bit vague here, in the sense that the attacker here could use a physical keylogger, they could use a software-based keylogger, they could use sort of replace the legitimate sort of login program at either end of the system potentially to retrieve the user's password. So again, that's something that could be expanded on quite significantly. Now, if you look at this attack tree, it's obviously a simple example. But as I've shown, it has a couple of flaws, and one of these that I've really gone through is the fact that it doesn't expand on some of these things. And certainly some of these issues like social engineering, the world readable and the shadow password file, even the dictionary attack, and these, particularly the keylogger as well, is something you could really expand on to create a much more meaningful and useful attack tree. This is really a very high level view of the possible attacks that you may have at your disposal, or from a defender's point of view that you will need to defend against and take some sort of countermeasures. The other thing I think, if you look at this, is that the attack tree has been created in what I would call a fairly ad hoc method. Now, the attack tree methodology itself is really meant to be a very methodical, considered sort of process for identifying attacks. And when you apply it in a very methodical way, with good sort of analyst knowledge and understanding and motivation, it can be extremely useful technique for identifying attacks that are, fair to say, so complex that unlikely to be discovered perhaps any other way. So that's definitely one sort of issue here. Now, if you look at this attack tree without really thinking too deeply about it, I think it's probably obvious that it's missing a big branch of attacks, which are that the password is sent across a network and is retrieved as it's sent across the network. And of course, you could then expand on that particular attack, which would really fall under this subtree somewhere, and look at is it sent in plain text. So then you could look at requirements involved in capturing it, which would mean, for example, the attacker is able to listen in on the network traffic. So you could expand that. Alternatively, is it sent cryptographically protected? How would you attack the cryptography to recover the password? And those kinds of things. So this is something that I think is a flaw with this particular attack tree. This lack of methodical or potential lack of methodical process is arguably the biggest sort of limitation of attack trees. If the person, the analyst who creates the attack tree, simply goes through and tries to tick all the boxes and get the tree finished as quickly as possible, then you'll end up with a tree that most likely will emit obvious attacks and almost certainly emit some attacks that are very subtle attacks. So the best way of addressing this, or one way of addressing this that I would suggest, is to adopt, firstly you have to adopt the mindset that you are going to be as comprehensive as possible, bearing in mind the assumptions or limitations of scope that you may have set before you begin the process, or indeed that evolve while you're actually creating the tree. The other sort of thing that you can do when developing this tree is from the top level down, so that is from this first sort of row of nodes in the tree, the first level in the tree, what you want to do is try to adopt an approach where you have a set of nodes at that level where each of them is mutually exclusive with the other. So a simple example for this, if we look at this high level goal, learn the user's Unix password, what we want to adopt is two set of mutually exclusive or logically complementary sort of possibilities. So how can you learn the user's password? Well, one option is you obtain it from the user, and the other option is you obtain it from the system. Now, to some degree, these two are the only possibilities. You could argue that the user's password may be stored on a third-party system. Maybe it's already been leaked and it's been published by some hacking group. But and that could indeed be a third possibility, which would then cover all the different possible scenarios. But otherwise, you can say that this is basically the two possibilities. So if we look at they obtain obtain the password from the user, then we have two logically complementary or mutually exclusive possibilities there as well. The user could know that you've obtained the password from them, if you threaten them, for example, or the user doesn't know. And you can then break those down. And if you keep, for as long as possible, maintaining usually two different options and breaking these down in relation to the different possibilities within each of those, but ensuring that at a particular level you cover all possibilities. And if you use two mutually exclusive things that cover all possibilities, either something is or it isn't, for example, then that works. If you were to consider obtaining the user's password from the system, then you could consider scenarios where the attacker has login access to the system, or you could consider scenarios where the attacker doesn't have login access to the system. And obviously those are the only possibilities by simple logic. If you take this kind of approach, you'll end up with an attack tree that's more likely to be methodical and therefore complete. It will be a little bit bigger than if you don't, but it will be better structured and, as I said, more likely to not miss any sort of major obvious problems, and more likely to pick up the subtle problems. Now, you don't want to have an attack tree that is huge. At some point, you do want to stop, so you need to identify the different points at which you're going to terminate this process of creating the attack tree. A couple of other sort of housekeeping issues, in a sense, with the attack tree. The symbols that we've used here are one of a set of numerous different symbols that do get used. I'm quite comfortable with these symbols. The software that I used in the past to create this tree used these symbols, and I got very familiar with them. But they're not a standard set of symbols. As long as there is a clear difference, I think, between the AND and the OR nodes in the tree, then that's more than fine. Leaf nodes, more or less, are going to be something very similar to this, I would say. But that's if you want to use slightly different symbols, as long as you very clearly define what they are, I guess that is okay. In terms of drawing the tree, my suggestion is you start with a large piece of paper and start sketching it out from there. Again, using that process of trying to identify logically complementary different possibilities that cover all possible options as you go through that process. The last thing that I want to consider is the issue of what's called pruning the tree, basically cutting out parts of the tree that are considered to be not relevant for some reason. And the way this is done is basically by looking at these leaf nodes and assigning them an attribute of some sort. Now, the most basic attribute you can assign to a leaf node is possible or not possible. So, for example, here we might say that the dictionary attack is impossible because we are making an assumption, which would need to be documented elsewhere, that the user's password has sufficient entropy to resist a dictionary attack. So that might be something that you would then label as impossible. And you should note that even if these two, either or both of these nodes are possible, if this node is impossible, because that's an AND node, it requires both of those conditions to be met, then this is automatically going to be an impossible subtree. If you label all of these nodes with possible or impossible, you should end up, and then remove the subtrees that are impossible, you should end up with the scenarios that are actually valid for the assumptions that you've made. Now, leaf nodes attributes can be more complex than simply possible or impossible. You could assign a cost, for example, to the nodes, and then you could look at the tree and analyze it to identify what attacks are possible within, if we assume a maximum cost of X number of dollars, for example. My suggestion when you're looking at the trees that you create is to identify the things that are going to be assumed to be possible or not possible based on your assumptions, and then label your nodes as follows. If you do that, when you go through the tree, you can then easily remove out the subtrees and nodes that become impossible through that process. Obviously, for an OR node or a subtree starting from an OR node to be possible, then it just needs one of its subtrees in turn to be possible. For an AND node, it needs all of its subtrees to be possible. So AND nodes, therefore, are much more likely to end up being impossible, whereas OR nodes representing options are more likely to be possible in the end. If you end up with an empty tree, then you've got no attacks, but most likely you end up with a tree that does contain some attacks. And these are the attacks that, for your assumptions, are still valid. And by going through this process of trying to identify all of the attack scenarios and then eliminating, based on your hopefully correct assumptions, the attack scenarios that remain, assuming those assumptions are valid, is a very useful process before ending up with the list of valid attacks that you need to consider when trying to improve the security of the system. So that brings this brief tutorial to an end. I hope it's useful to you, and please contact me if you have any questions.